What happens to a country built on force when the sea it depends on starts turning into a locked gate? And what if the most dangerous attack is not missiles falling from the sky, but money, fuel, and access slowly being choked off? Before we go deeper, hit like if you want sharp analysis without the noise, subscribe if you follow power shifts around the world, and share this with one friend who loves strategy more than slogans. That is the fear hiding inside this story. Not just war, not just ships, not even just NATO. The real fear is that Russia could be pushed into a trap where every move becomes more expensive, more risky, and more humiliating. And for Moscow, the Baltic Sea is not some side theater. It is one of the few remaining doors that still opens toward money, trade, and military reach in Europe. That is why one warning from a French general hit so hard. Because when French military chief Fabien Mondon spoke about the Baltic becoming something NATO could shut down if it had to, he was not talking like a television commentator. He was speaking from the cold logic of geography. Since Finland and Sweden joined NATO, the map changed in a way Russia cannot ignore. 8 of the 9 countries around the Baltic Sea are now in the alliance. That means Russia is the outsider on a coastline where it once hoped to intimidate everybody else. For years, the Baltic looked like a contested zone. Now, from Moscow's point of view, it increasingly looks like a narrow corridor watched from almost every side. And this is where the story becomes much bigger than one statement from Paris. Because France is not important here, only because of what it said. France matters because its voice adds weight, military credibility, and nuclear backing to a regional reality that was already moving against Russia. If the Baltic is becoming harder for Moscow to use, that is not because France can wave a hand and close the sea tomorrow morning. It is because the whole balance around that sea has shifted. France is one of the powers now saying the quiet part out loud. To understand why this matters, picture the Baltic not as water, but as a pipeline made of shipping lanes. Through that water move oil, fuel, cargo, naval forces, pressure, leverage, and political messages. Russian ports on the Baltic, especially around St. Petersburg and Primorsk, matter because they connect Russia to global markets far more directly than long detours would. Analysts have warned that a large share of Russia's seaborne crude exports still leaves through Baltic ports. If that traffic is slowed, inspected, deterred, sanctioned, or made uninsurable, the pain is not symbolic. It is financial, it is strategic, and over time it becomes political. That is why the phrase blockade gets attention. But we need to be careful here, because most people hear that word and imagine something dramatic and immediate. Warships across a strait, missiles locked on targets, a public declaration, a sudden act of war. That is the movie version. The real version would likely look very different. It would be slower, more legalistic, more deniable, more selective. And in some ways, that makes it even more dangerous. The first point to understand is this. Russia does not need the Baltic to be physically sealed shut to feel the pressure. It only needs the sea to become unreliable. That is the nightmare, not a total wall. A hostile filter. A sea where suspicious tankers are tracked more closely. A sea where insurance papers matter. A sea where environmental rules become weapons. A sea where old tankers with murky ownership start getting stopped, checked, delayed, sanctioned, or boarded. A sea where every voyage carries more cost and more uncertainty. Because the Russian system can survive pain. What it struggles with is compounding friction on the machine that funds the state. This is why the shadow fleet matters so much. That term sounds dramatic, but the idea is simple. It refers to the aging, hard-to-track, often weakly insured tanker network used to keep Russian oil moving around sanctions. These ships became central after Western restrictions tried to squeeze Russia's energy income, and the Baltic is one of the key spaces where that traffic passes. Denmark and Sweden have both discussed ways to increase pressure on such vessels, especially by focusing on insurance, safety, environmental rules, and sanction enforcement. That matters because the Danish Straits are one of the main exits from the Baltic to the wider ocean. If you cannot move safely through that funnel, the map starts closing around you. Now think about what that means in plain terms. A state at war needs cash. Cash comes from exports. Exports need routes. Routes need ships. Ships need legal cover, insurance, ports, crews, tracking, and tolerance from the countries whose waters they cross. Take away enough of those layers, and you do not need to sink a tanker to hurt the system. You just need to make the business model shaky enough that risk spreads through everything. Freight gets harder, costs rise, middlemen hesitate, buyers demand discounts, delays stack up, and suddenly something that looked like a clever workaround starts looking fragile. That is why Russia's Baltic problem is not just naval, it is economic oxygen. If the Black Sea is contested and the Baltic becomes tighter, then the pressure on Russia's export network grows from 2 sides at once. And this matters not only for oil sales, it matters for the wider message. If NATO can make one of Russia's most important maritime arteries feel exposed, then it is showing Moscow that geography is no longer a comfort. It is a liability. But here is where serious analysis has to slow down. Because saying the Baltic can be closed is not the same as saying it can be closed easily, legally, or without enormous risk. That is the part sensational videos often skip, and it is the part that matters most. The Baltic is not a video game map. It is a crowded sea with international law, civilian shipping, energy infrastructure, and nuclear powers staring at each other. A real blockade would not just be a military move. It would be a political earthquake, and every government involved knows it. That is why what we are seeing right now is not a clean wartime blockade. It is something more subtle. NATO launched Baltic Sentry in early 2025 after a series of damaging incidents involving undersea cables and critical infrastructure. The mission was presented as protection, surveillance, and deterrence. Frigates, patrol aircraft, and naval drones were part of that effort. Officially, this is about security in a region where pipelines, power lines, and data cables suddenly feel vulnerable. But unofficially, everyone understands the wider message. The alliance is increasing its presence, improving its awareness, and showing it can act. That alone changes the psychology of the sea. And psychology matters in strategy more than many people realize. Because power is not only what you can destroy, it is also what others believe you can disrupt. If ship operators think Baltic traffic is under intense scrutiny, behavior changes. If Russia thinks that suspicious vessels could face inspection or detention under legal pretexts, planning changes. If insurers think the region is becoming politically radioactive, contracts change. The sea starts looking less like a highway and more like a checkpoint. And once trade routes lose confidence, pressure builds faster than people expect. So where does France come into this? Why is Paris able to make so much noise with one warning? Because France is not just another NATO member. It is Europe's strongest military power inside the European Union. It has nuclear weapons. It has blue water naval reach. It has a serious air force. It has expeditionary experience. And unlike some countries that speak carefully, France often chooses strategic theater on purpose. Paris understands signaling. A sentence from a French general is designed not only to describe reality, but to shape it. It is meant to harden nerves in Europe and unsettle nerves in Moscow. There is also a political reason. For a long time, Emmanuel Macron tried to keep space open for dialogue with Russia, or at least for the appearance of strategic balance. That image has changed. The tone from Paris has become harder. Partly because the war in Ukraine changed Europe's assumptions. Partly because attacks, sabotage fears, and energy pressure made the whole continent feel more exposed. And partly because France sees an opening. If the United States becomes less predictable, then leadership inside Europe matters more. That gives Paris a reason to sound tougher, act tougher, and show that it is ready to shape the military conversation. If this breakdown is helping you see the map behind the headlines, tap the like button now. Subscribe for more long-form strategy stories, and send this video to someone who thinks geopolitics is just noise until the pressure points are explained. Still, rhetoric is one thing, capability is another. Could France actually help enforce pressure in the Baltic if events escalated? Yes, but not in the simplistic way many viral scripts describe it. France would not be doing this alone, and that distinction matters. The countries sitting directly on the Baltic hold much of the local geography. Denmark watches the Straits, Sweden sits on critical islands and sea lanes. Finland and Estonia shape the narrow Gulf of Finland corridor. Poland and Germany add logistics, firepower, and regional weight. Britain brings naval and intelligence strength. France brings high-end military tools, air and naval muscle, and political signal value. The pressure would be collective, not French solo theater. And that collective picture is exactly what worries Moscow. Because Russia's problem is no longer just one rival navy. It is a layered system. Surveillance from the air, sensors and drones at sea, coast guards, naval patrols, sanctions enforcement, port restrictions, insurance checks, customs scrutiny, intelligence sharing, legal pressure. And behind all of it, the possibility that a crisis could turn this whole network from monitoring into coercion very fast. That is how modern pressure works. Not one dramatic door slam, 100 tightening screws. Russia knows this, and that is why Kaliningrad matters so much in the conversation. Kaliningrad is Russia's western military outpost. Wedged between NATO members and separated from mainland Russia, it houses military assets, serves as a strategic symbol, and gives Moscow a way to project force into the Baltic region. But it is also a vulnerability. In peacetime, it is a fortified foothold. In a major crisis, it can start looking like a forward position that is hard to support. If the maritime link to Kaliningrad becomes less secure, Russia faces a painful truth. The very place it uses to intimidate NATO can also become a source of strategic anxiety. That is one reason the Baltic feels so dangerous. Each side looks at the same map and sees both strength and weakness. NATO sees a chance to contain. Russia sees a risk of encirclement. NATO sees infrastructure to defend. Russia sees choke points that could be used against it. NATO sees law and enforcement. Russia sees selective pressure and political warfare. And when both sides believe the other is slowly changing the facts, the room for miscalculation gets smaller. This is also why the phrase NATO Lake is both useful and misleading. Useful, because alliance geography has clearly improved. Misleading, because the Baltic is still risky, crowded, and highly escalatory. Chatham House warned that the sea is far from being a simple lake under uncontested NATO control. Russia still has ways to cause trouble. It can jam signals. It can threaten undersea infrastructure. It can use hybrid tactics. It can stage aggressive air and naval behavior. It can test reactions at the edge of legality. And most dangerously, it can turn pressure into a nuclear warning faster than most Western publics are comfortable imagining. That last point matters more than almost anything else. Because when people say Russia cannot survive a Baltic squeeze, we need to define what cannot survive really means. It does not mean the Russian state disappears in a week. It does not mean Moscow runs out of options overnight. And it does not mean one inspection campaign ends the war. What it means is more structural. Russia has built resilience around pain, but its war effort still depends on steady revenue, steady logistics, and the image that it can outlast the West. If one of its key maritime outlets becomes a long-term source of attrition, then the cost curve bends in a dangerous direction. Not all at once, but steadily. And that may be the most important word in this entire story. Steadily. Because great powers often do not break from one blow. They weaken from sustained pressure that exposes every hidden weakness at the same time. A strained budget, a discounted oil trade, a nervous currency, higher insurance costs, longer shipping routes, a more isolated navy, an exposed exclave in Kaliningrad, a nervous elite, a public told the state is strong while the strategic map keeps shrinking. That is how anxiety spreads through a system built on control. Moscow, of course, is not helpless, and this is another place where lazy analysis goes wrong. Russia still has military tools. It still has the Baltic Fleet, even if many analysts doubt that fleet could dominate the sea in a crisis against a prepared NATO coalition. It still has missiles in and around Kaliningrad. It still has submarines, aviation, and coastal defenses. It still has cyber tools. It still has sabotage options. And it still has the ability to scare Europe by raising the nuclear shadow. That means any move against Russian maritime access would carry danger far beyond shipping. No serious planner forgets that. Russia also has one powerful habit: turning legal gray zones into strategic weapons. If the West uses safety rules, insurance checks, or environmental standards to increase pressure, Moscow will say this proves the rules-based order was always selective. If ships are stopped, Russia will call it piracy or economic war. If NATO expands patrols, Russia will call it provocation. If undersea infrastructure is guarded more aggressively, Russia may answer with more covert disruption elsewhere. This is not just about ships. It is about narrative, escalation, and testing how much pain the other side is willing to absorb. That is why the French warning matters psychologically. It suggests that Europe is becoming more willing to impose pain instead of merely reacting to it. For years, a lot of Western policy looked defensive: sanction packages, statements, limited military aid, cautious enforcement. Now the language is changing. Not everywhere, not all at once, but enough to notice. Instead of asking only how to protect against Russia, some leaders are asking how to make Russian pressure fail. And in the Baltic, that means making maritime access itself part of the contest. There is a deeper layer here too. The real target may not be Russian ships. It may be Russian certainty. If the Kremlin believes it can always route around sanctions, always exploit legal caution, always use old tankers and hidden owners to keep the cash flowing, then it keeps the initiative. But if Europe starts proving that these workarounds can be exposed, delayed, penalized, or selectively disrupted, then the Kremlin loses something bigger than money. It loses predictability. And authoritarian systems hate unpredictability when it touches revenue. That is why this is such a dangerous game, because from the Western side, limited maritime pressure can look like smart enforcement. From the Russian side, the same pressure can look like a slow-motion siege. From the Western side, boarding a suspicious vessel can look lawful. From the Russian side, it can look like a test of resolve that must be answered. From the Western side, air patrols and naval drones can look stabilizing. From the Russian side, they can look like preparation for strangulation. And once both sides are locked inside those interpretations, small incidents become huge. A damaged cable, a detained tanker, a radar lock, a fighter intercept that goes wrong, a warship escorting a sanctioned vessel, a drone near an offshore site. Any one of these could light a fuse. This is why the Baltic matters so much right now. Not because a final showdown is guaranteed, but because the region has become the place where law, energy, geography, and deterrence are all colliding in the same cold water. Quick pause before the final piece clicks into place. If you want more scripts that break world events into clear human language, subscribe now, leave a comment with the next flashpoint you want covered, and share this video so the algorithm knows serious viewers are still here. Now let's come back to the title. What is the one thing Russia cannot survive? It is not losing one ship. It is not one harsh speech from France. It is not even one NATO mission by itself. The thing Russia cannot survive forever is the steady erosion of the system that turns exports into state power. That is the heart of it. Russia can survive fear. It can survive casualties. It can survive isolation longer than many expected. But if the flow of money, access, and strategic freedom keeps narrowing, then the pressure moves from the edges of the state toward the center, toward the budget, toward elite confidence, toward military sustainability, toward the basic promise that the Kremlin can always endure more than its enemies. And this is exactly why the Baltic is so important. Because unlike abstract sanctions announced from podiums, the Baltic is physical, it is measurable. It is where tankers either pass or do not pass, where patrol aircraft either watch or do not watch, where cables either remain intact or get damaged, where coast guards either board ships or back away, where NATO either proves its regional advantage matters or shows it was bluffing. The sea is where the strategic talk becomes real. France understands this. That is why its warning carried force. Not because Paris alone can flick a switch and suffocate Russia, but because France represents something larger, a Europe that is slowly rediscovering hard power, a Europe that is less shocked by the language of deterrence than it was a few years ago, a Europe that is beginning to accept that protecting itself may require not only defense, but controlled forms of coercion. That is a huge psychological shift. And once that shift happens, statements that once sounded impossible start sounding like future policy. But there is still a line most Western governments do not want to cross. They do not want a formal naval blockade that openly triggers a direct NATO-Russia confrontation. They do not want to be seen as starting a wider war. They do not want oil prices spiking globally. They do not want to hand Moscow a clean propaganda win. And they absolutely do not want a crisis that suddenly turns Kaliningrad, the Danish Straits, and the Gulf of Finland into the front line of a direct great power clash. So the likely path is not sudden closure. It is calibrated pressure, inspection, deterrence, surveillance, legal aggression, selective interdiction, sanctions that become harder to evade. In other words, a squeeze without saying the word squeeze. That makes the contest harder to see, but not less real. In fact, it may already be happening in slow motion. Every new patrol, every legal discussion, every sanction package, every undersea cable protection mission, every warning about uninsured tankers, every debate over who can board what ship and under what justification. These are all pieces of the same puzzle. They tell us the Baltic is no longer just a body of water on a map. It is becoming a pressure chamber. For Russia, the worst-case scenario is not simply that NATO closes the sea one day. It is that the sea stops feeling safe long before that day ever comes. Because once shipping becomes uncertain, planning becomes uncertain. Once planning becomes uncertain, revenue becomes uncertain. And once revenue becomes uncertain, in a wartime economy, loyalty and confidence do not stay untouched. That does not mean collapse tomorrow. It means a state built on projection starts spending more energy protecting itself from strategic suffocation. And that is exhausting. So when a French general says the Baltic can now be shut if necessary, hear the statement for what it really is. It is not a countdown to instant war. It is a message about leverage, a reminder that the map has changed, a warning that Russia's western maritime lifeline now runs through a region where its enemies have more eyes, more tools, more legal arguments, and more confidence than before. And above all, it is a signal that Europe is thinking less about absorbing pressure and more about applying it. That is the new reality Moscow hates. Not just stronger sanctions, not just more NATO flags, but the idea that the West is starting to understand where Russia is actually vulnerable. Not everywhere, not in fantasy, in specific places, specific routes, specific systems. The Baltic is one of those places. And once a rival identifies the artery, every ship that passes through it starts to look different. In the end, this story is not really about one French warning. It is about a strategic truth Russia cannot ignore. A great power can survive insults. It can survive setbacks. It can even survive battlefield losses longer than outsiders expect. But if it loses secure access to money, movement, and maritime confidence, the damage goes much deeper. That kind of pressure does not explode. It accumulates, quietly, coldly, relentlessly. And that is exactly why the Baltic has become one of the most dangerous seas on Earth. Because the next battle there may not begin with the sound of gunfire. It may begin with a tanker stopped, a signal jammed, an aircraft intercepted, a cable cut, or a captain told to prove his papers. And by the time the world realizes what that means, the real fight may already be underway.